You can see I have all those pages have been opened and looked at and read. I
Oh
read,
my goodness.
I read the whole darn book, every bit of it.
Well, I wouldn't expect anything less from you.
Uh-huh. You know, I didn't know if I'd read it all. Sometimes it gets hard, but I was just absolutely enthralled with the book. And I was like, oh, this is just like terrific. It's like a book I would have written, honestly. You
Oh,
know,
yours would have been better.
and I don't mean that in like a egotistical way. It's just when I say the book I would have written, I love that it was a history lesson of the times and everything that happened. It's just not here's Curtis, have at it. No, it's everything. And it was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I want to know.
Yeah, it's what I want to know too. I wanted to know what made him tick.
Exactly.
And you can only understand what made people tick is if you know what was going on around them, the culture they grew up in,
Yep.
and so spent a lot of time developing that, the importance of religion in his family. His father was a pastor,
Yeah.
traveling minister for the United Brethren Church,
Yep.
and today, religion is kind of marginalized. If we had you and I were giving a talk in front of an auditorium full of people, if we said everybody stand up that goes to church and reads the Bible, no one would. They'd be embarrassed. No one would stand up. But in the 1950s, before Vietnam, everybody would have stood up, and people would have been embarrassed not to say they're going to church. That's the cultural change that's happened today,
Yes.
and so many authors write from that perspective, and they marginalize Curtis's adoration for his father, who was
Hmm.
a pastor. And Curtis had the best training possible by having grown up in a poor family, but a family that had faith, and he admired his father, and religion was very important to him, and it was incredibly important to the indigenous cultures. I mean, their whole life was surrounded. So when people today say, oh, I love Navajo blankets and trade blankets and Indian pictures, don't care much for religion, but I really understand the Indian. They don't understand them at all. That was the center of their universe, was their belief in their gods,
Yeah.
which varied from ours. And it was the real cultural point that the whites wanted to crush. And that's why they moved them off to off reservation
Yeah.
schools and
And the
got them out
people
of their
that
culture.
and the people that I know, Native Americans, Indians that I know, friends that I have, it's still a very important component. The people that I deal with in my world, whether they're weavers or painters or silversmiths, that's still a huge component of their life and dominates in many factors. Like this
Yes.
guy
Yeah.
who made this, Roy Talahattua. I mean, his culture, his religious beliefs are going to definitely trump anything else that he's doing in his world.
Exactly. And that's why I spent a lot of time on Midwestern values and the importance of religion to him, and growing up in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And when he's in church, he's hearing liturgies and songs and music and all that, and he gets out with the different Indian tribes, and he's hearing the same thing. He's hearing the beat of the drum and the whoop of the dance,
Yeah.
uh, as Sharp would say, and and so he was comfortable in that. And where he grew up in Minnesota, he had the Germans speaking German, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and a lot of churches were in those tongues. There's a great majority of people in the northern, that settled the northern areas, like where I grew up in Montana, that their first language was German. Or
Yeah.
so he was used to hearing not English. So it was a very seamless transition for him to go out all over the West, the 80 tribes, and do his work.
By the way, we haven't introduced you. So we have Len Peterson on. We have
Oh,
begun. Yeah, we just got going into it. The book we're talking about is Edward S. Curtis Printing the Legends, which is, if you're on YouTube, you can see this. He has one behind his desk as well, and it's just a fascinating book. Just came out, and so we're just jumping into it, which is good because there's a lot to it. It's a thick, heavy amount of material in this book. Reads wonderfully, and that's what I like about it so much. That's my wife was like, "Wow, you're really into this book." I go, "Yeah, I just can't put it down." It's because it's telling a story of history from really early on till his death, but it's not just here's Curtis and this is what we think. And so at this point, we've already started talking about Curtis's early upbringing, and his father was a traveling minister too, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
and that's I think an important component to think about, and you obviously have. But if your father's traveling and you're going with him, you have to learn how to be very good with people that you don't know. And you're bringing the gospel to him, which makes you, in my opinion, also probably a fairly good orator, showman. And I'm sure none of this was lost on Curtis.
No, and also charisma, to convert people or deal with Native Americans, you have to have a certain amount of charisma. Some people have it, some people don't. It's disarming and welcomes them into your world. And he definitely got that from his father. I mean, it was a perfect apprenticeship to see his father traveling around. A lot of the Methodists, Brother Van, famous one in Montana, traveled around, and they went to community, and they were common people. They weren't, from Yale or have some divinity degree. They were just farmers and ranchers who wanted to spread the word. And I mean, it was perfect training for Curtis. And he definitely had charisma, but it never outpaced his character, because a lot of people use charisma to do lots of not good things. And that was never the case with him. So it was a perfect match of charisma and character.
Yeah, with Curtis himself, not his father, but with Curtis himself.
Yeah. And I think his father was probably the same way.
Yeah, well, his father was a minister in the Civil War for the Union, right?
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating kind of unraveling this whole story is his father. A lot of folks don't understand. A little perspective here. 20th century, 100 million people were killed by Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. Mm-hmm. Big number. 300 million died of smallpox.
Right.
A similar number, hundreds of millions died of tuberculosis. So you go back to the Civil War, a lot of people think, it was 600,000 people died and it was all bullets and bayonets and cannonballs. 400,000 of the 600,000 died from tuberculosis, typhoid fever, cholera, trench foot, scurvy, malaria. Diseases were rampant and there was no treatment. So it just,
I like that
and
part.
I think his father.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like that part of your book, you being a physician as well, and maybe as from my perspective as well, that it really did give it as a perspective of, okay, this is a really important disease that affected the world, United States, and Curtis, which we'll go into because it obviously affected him. But you were saying about his father who sees all this, right?
And I think contracted probably tuberculosis from the people he was serving. For sure, he died at 47 of lung problems. And,
hectic.
One of, and by the 19th century, 1 of 7 people that had ever lived died of tuberculosis.
Yes.
Every family had tuberculosis.
Yes.
J.P. Morgan's first wife, he married her 4 months later. She dies of tuberculosis. I could go on and on. Cornelius Vanderbilt, grooming his oldest son to take over the empire. He goes to West Point, gets in the Civil War. He dies of tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy Russell's, Charlie Russell's wife, obviously got probably tuberculosis from her mother who died, and Helen of tuberculosis. And you can just go on and on. It permeated every family.
Yes.
So it was a big deal.
Yeah. When I was reading your book, I immediately go to Dixon, who died of COPD, but you had to wonder, how did he not avoid tuberculosis in some ways? And it probably was a fearful thing for him, and maybe also added to his wanting to be out in the desert and be alone and those kind of things. that I never really had thought about. I thought about it with the pandemic flu, how devastating that would have been to him. But, the fact that tuberculosis was everywhere and so many people had it, I'm sure it had to be in his mindset at times as well.
And he could have been a carrier. That's why when people get new immune therapies, they always do TB skin tests, because that's the thing I also want folks to understand is I think Curtis had tuberculosis for sure.
Yeah,
and some people, never get sick. Some people get sick and get well, and they can go through the whole life with these intermittent flares, especially when they get run down. And I think that's certainly the case for Curtis.
Twice it sounds.
But he didn't want,
right? Two different times.
Yes, yeah, and obviously he didn't want his benefactors to know about that. They wouldn't give him a nickel. You got tuberculosis and you want to do this over 20, 25 years, forget it.
Right. Yeah. Especially JP Morgan. He'd be like, no way.
Yes. Yeah, no way that he would. It's almost like the Scarlet Letter. They had to hide it.
Yes. And so do we have a sense of his father, having been in the Civil War and seeing all that misery, getting TB more than likely from it, how that affected his son? I mean, Dixon again had the same thing with his father, who was a colonel, who was in the the South, and basically I think it drove him mad. I think he Dixon's father never recovered really from the Civil War. Do we have any sense of that for Curtis and his father?
It's described as an unhappy person, sickly person. There's not a lot known about him. It obviously, I think, around 1887, 1888, that they moved Curtis and took his dad out to the Puget Sound area, by Port Angeles. And I think they went out there chasing the cure. Your hometown of Tucson was a hotbed for people to go. Tuberculosis sufferers, Pasadena, Colorado Springs, Silver City,
Albuquerque,
and so they went out there, I think, kind of chasing the cure. They were out there. He was really sick. Obviously, he was so sick that if they weren't trying to find something to help him, they wouldn't have moved him. And he died a few months later.
And so he dies because Curtis is born in 1868, right?
Right.
And when does his father die? 88?
He dies like 88 when he's like 46, 47 years old.
Yeah.
And then Curtis and the family are left there to kind of, fend for themselves.
Yeah, he's 20 years old. Yeah.
And then the interesting thing about it, shortly thereafter, and Curtis is the caretaker. So imagine he's in a little cabin with his father coughing tuberculosis bacteria all over the place. That's how people usually got it with close contact.
And it's humid.
And then there's a year there that none of the family ever talks about in all the books that have been written. But William Phillips, a cousin in it, is unpublished memoir in 1913 mentions that Curtis was in bed for a year.
Right.
And the family said, well, it was a fall that hurt his spine. Yeah. Well, you're not going to sit in bed for a year with a spinal, and when you get out, you're not mountain climbing a year later. I think he was bedridden with tuberculosis that he picked up from his father.
Makes sense.
So
totally makes sense, and that's a new thing people don't know about, right?
No, none of this is.
Yeah,
there's lots of new things in this.
Yeah,
a lot of his story is not what you've read about.
Yes, yeah, which is very interesting. We'll get into some of that as well, because his biggest savior of George Bird Grinnell doesn't sound like it occurred.
No, it's like a lot of folks that are around famous people. They tend to use them to perpetuate their own legend,
right?
That's Curtis very much used Grinnell who was a god to everybody in America.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Grinnell for the people who may not know who this man is.
Well, George Bird Grinnell grew up in Audubon Park in New York City, went to Yale, brilliant man. He went out to the Black Hills, right with Custer. They invited him to come in for the June 1876 little thing in eastern Montana, and if he had gone, he probably might have gotten killed.
Yes.
But he goes on to Yale and buys part of Forest and Stream magazine. Very much really wants to preserve Native Americans, wildlife, writes a lot about it. He writes a lot of great books on the Pawnee and the Blackfeet, and friends with Theodore Roosevelt. They start the Boone and Crockett Club together. And so at Father of Glacier Park, he helped get Glacier Park into a park in 1910. So just a ton of things. Audubon Society, he started a version of that. So a very famous man in America and very powerful.
And connected, obviously.
And connected, yeah. Because the Boone and Crockett Club had, all the biggies were on that. Bierstadt was there, and a lot of politicians and wealthy people.
And so he is, his meeting of Curtis in, when they take the trip, it was in 1899, but supposedly he meets him and saves him and on Mount Rainier, right?
Yeah, in 1898, the story goes that Grinnell and John Muir, who starts the Sierra Club, and C. Hart Merriam, who's the head of the Division of Biological Survey, get lost on Rainier. Grinnell saves them, takes them down to his studio. They invite him to go on the 1899 trip.
Curtis saves them, not
Edward H. Harriman.
Right. Grinnell saves them.
Alaska.
Curtis saves them, not Grinnell, supposedly, right?
Curtis saves them.
Yeah.
Grinnell and all these scientists are lost on.
Right.
But problem is that story was first written about in 1962 by a guy named Andrews, and then multiple books, and it's been carried on every book until about 5 or 6 years ago. John Tolliver, who wrote a foreword for the book, was the Grinnell expert, and then Brian Dippie also wrote on the Vanishing American, which he's the ultimate expert on that area. John told me about, a few years ago that, Grinnell wasn't up there that year. Grinnell wrote like 2,000 letters in this period that were kind of investigating the Grinnell-Curtis relationship. And Grinnell wasn't even close to Mount Rainier. So he didn't save any of the famous scientists, as has been written about perpetually. So that is a legend.
Right.
And part of the title of printing the legends is not only printing the Native American images, but printing all these legends that have come up with Curtis and kind of trying to figure it all out. And a lot of these are head scratchers. But that whole story of Grinnell and others being saved by Curtis on Mount Rainier is not true.
Right. But did Curtis proliferate that concept back in the day?
He in his late life was when he started telling a lot of potboilers about his life, like a lot of people do, to a librarian at the Seattle Public Library.
Right.
And he also wrote kind of a memoir. That really didn't get perpetuated until in 1962, right before the Vietnam War. Andrews came out with his book, and then Curtis's daughter Florence Graybill wrote a couple books with a guy named Boson in 1976 and 77, and that's where that whole story was kind of developed. It came out of that, so that was kind of in those books there. That's kind of when the legend started, and every book that's come out since has picked that up and run with it.
Well, makes a good story, right? And then
it's a great story, yeah.
But where did he meet? We don't really know where he met Grinnell.
I think the first time was on the 1899 expedition to Alaska that Harriman paid for. He got this huge ship.
Yeah, it sounds like unbelievable with all the people.
Oh yeah, Muir, Gifford, Burroughs, Yellowstone Kelly. Yeah. Really at that point, Curtis was known as a studio photographer in Seattle,
Right.
prominent with all the rich folks. But he really wasn't known, and they had dinner at the Rainier Club in Seattle, and then went out, left on the ship for a couple months. But he was picked as the photographer, maybe from some connections with some of these people, but he got to go up and be around all these folks for a couple months and photograph them and photograph Alaska. But he was just a photographer. He wasn't a big deal then. I mean, he would have been kind of in the background of kind of absorbing. Grinnell gave lectures on board the ship,
Right.
and so that's when he met Grinnell. And how many more times he met Grinnell is a mystery.
Mm. But he also got to spend time with Harriman, who's one of the biggest capitalist leaders in the entire country. I mean,
yeah, he owned the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, you know, who published Sunset Magazine that your Maynard Dixon was on the cover of.
Right.
I had those posters 40 years ago, and he owned ran Wells Fargo. Yeah, so Harriman was incredibly wealthy, influential.
Huge.
Yeah.
And he gets 2 months with him and gets to photograph him and
Yeah.
everything, and probably the bear that he killed, which is why Harriman went out to kill his Kodiak.
Exactly. Kodiak. Yeah, exactly.
And then they publish a book,
Harriman's,
right?
yeah, and then Harriman's got that little phonograph at Edison with the wax cylinders that Curtis picks up on, and then he takes those out and does like 10,000 wax cylinders of songs and music from all the different tribes. So
we know how many of those are still left in existence.
I'm not sure. I think Indiana University has a bunch of them, but a lot of them have been recorded and saved on these wax. They used the wax when they were soft wax, and then they developed into hard wax, and then they just went to like a Mylar film sort of stuff eventually.
Yeah, and I learned from your book that they had a minimal lifespan. Like the soft ones were like you could do it 7 times or something. The hard ones went up to like maybe 20 times, and
exactly.
Which is
so some of it's probably a lot of these early recordings, just like the nitrate film from the early films, are are gone.
Yeah.
A lot of the early films never survived.
Yes.
But so that was a huge trip for him. He was a trader in Navajo blankets, and
I learned that about that too, which is very interesting.
Yeah, so he very much, he loved the Southwest. He went down to visit the Hopi, I think 10 times, 10, 12 times. He never visited any other tribe as much as he did, the Southwestern tribes.
Well, this fact that he worked with Hubble selling rugs, Dixon did the same thing.
Exactly. And I know from learning from you, he pulled the rug out when the earthquake in San Francisco. He wanted to
didn't want to Hubble.
Save that rug.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it's so interesting that, because part of me when I'm following this book is because the question has always been, I posed it to you, did Curtis and Dixon know each other? And my response has always been, when I've given lectures, not to my knowledge. After reading your book, I'm convinced that they had many interactions with other people that were very intimate into their lives. But did they meet? I do not know, but I bet they had opinions about each other. That I bet.
My opinion is I have no doubt that they met, because they had the Biltmore Salon in there that Frank Tenney jumped. And as we've talked about before, Dixon went down there and gave a show. Curtis was there right when the Biltmore Open Hotel, the big, beautiful showcase hotel in downtown LA. Curtis put his studio in that was his second studio, and he would have been there. That's why Charlie Russell went by, and Will James. If this comes up with a second printing, a friend of mine sent me photos that he did of Will James in 1927, and he actually has the check that Will James wrote Curtis for the sitting. And so I would think for sure they would have met each other. Now, Curtis wasn't in that studio all the time. His daughter Beth and her husband Magnuson ran the studio and basically was running the business. And as he was running out, trying to finish the North American Indian volumes.
Well, the two people that Dixon really thought of as, father figures, Hubble, who he calls Patron. And so
Sure.
Hubble and Curtis and Hubble and Dixon are both buying and selling weaving. So, and that's early on. So they knew about that. And then Charles Loomis, who was
Right.
really, he called him father, and they called each other father and son. And in your book, you noted in 1907, when they had the great bank panic, that, and Curtis has gotten all this money from, Morgan, but he's worried now too that everything's going to shut down. And Curtis and he's writing Curtis is writing Loomis. Well, at that same time, Loomis is writing about Dixon, who's going to New York, and how he's going to do, and Maynard's writing Loomis about the bank failure because he lost his money in it. So right there, there's this, and I know, they were talking back and forth. I mean, with Loomis being a key pen between those two men, there's no doubt that they were talked about. The question really is, what did they think about each other? And was there a rivalry in some way?
Between Curtis and Dixon?
Yes. And
I
I don't think there would be in Curtis's mind.
no.
Dixon, I could see it.
You know his mind better than mine. Well, yeah, people that are competitive.
Right.
But and Charles Loomis, didn't Dixon and Breen both get married in
Yes.
his home? Their
Yes.
first marriage.
Yes.
Dixon's first marriage.
Yes.
And
1905.
but in 1907 too, Loomis founded the Southwest Museum in
That's
Los
right.
Angeles.
Right.
And in 1923, Curtis and Mara Ellis Ryan initiate the Indian Welfare League, or they start that up.
Right.
And the Southwest Museum is kind of where they did it.
Yeah.
So there's all these connections.
Yes. And Dixon, Dixon would, I don't know if he's exactly in that league, and I have to go again. When I read your book, I go, okay, I got to go do the deep dive and see if his name's on that, because Dixon was very much about, boarding schools were a bad thing. He was about indigenous native rights, and so was Curtis. And 23, they do what you say. In 23, Dixon's spending 7 months at Hopi, right? So he would have known Ryan as well, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And for sure. And Dixon, he spends all this time at Hopi at the same time that, because in your book you say Curtis goes, I think 1900, starts at 1900,
right,
going to Hopi, same time Dixon goes out there. So they had to interlap many, many times. The question is, why isn't there anything written that I've found or you found?
Yeah, I don't
It's
know.
out there somewhere.
It is.
I'm convinced of it after reading your book.
Well,
Literally.
once you always have to stay humble with this, because once you think you got it all figured out, then there's new material that come up, and so a lot of this is a mystery, and we just have to accept mysteries like Native Americans do.
Yeah, well, I think we also just look at the timelines of when these, if nothing else, all the interactions that these pivotal players like Hubble and Loomis, and also Stieglitz, right? So Curtis is involved with Stieglitz, right? Dixon doesn't like Stieglitz, but Curtis likes Stieglitz.
Well, and I could have done a chapter on Alfred Stieglitz. If people don't know who he is, they should.
Yes.
He's the one that started the pictorialist movement in the United States, and that's making a photograph look like a piece of art.
Yes.
And kind of art for art's sake. And he started in 1901 Camera Works, and he pulls in Edward Steichen.
Right.
And I'd love to talk about him forever, because Edward Steichen was a perfect one for that, because he was an accomplished painter and a photographer. Mm. In fact, a couple of years ago, one of his photographs, his pictorialist photographs, went for $12 million at auction. Only Man Ray has one photograph at $13 million. But Steichen went on to be like the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in the 1950s. He was a huge figure. And I only mentioned him in passing because I wanted to try to keep this book under 500 pages and 7 pounds. I mean, I could have got, I would love to, and Stieglitz marries, Georgia O'Keeffe, and they stayed married until 1948 or 47, and then she moves out to New Mexico, Ghost Ranch. But there's all these, and talking about Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange, she had kind of like, I think Curtis had to deal with tuberculosis. Well, she had to deal with polio.
That's right.
And she said in that famous quote, it controlled me, it humbled me, it guided me, and it was always in my mind. And people that have diseases, unless you've had it, that are chronic, I could have used her an example of someone that got a lot of empathy for migrant mother, during the Depression, and photographed that. I used FDR, who was a cocky, rich kid, Ivy League type, and then in 3 days he gets polio and doesn't walk again. Right. And it humbled him. And a lot of the programs that helped the marginal folks in the Depression years, and all of those, I think, was his empathy for the marginalized people in this world. And so humbling diseases can have a golden lining too, and I think that was true for so many people.
Yeah, and I mean, again, back to Dixon. I mean, he has asthma that he has to deal with his whole life, and it really affected him early on. And as you said, Dorothea had polio; it affected her leg, and that's why she and Frida Kahlo got along so well. And Dorothea actually introduced Frida to her doctor in San Francisco, and she did a bunch of paintings for them that are, that Frida did for the doctor. They're in the San Francisco Modern Museum of Art. And I agree with you. People that do have that, or even if they don't have it, if they live with someone who has it, gives them a different sense of empathy toward those conditions and what you have to deal with. And Curtis probably had it on two different ends for sure. And Dixon definitely did as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And I like that you brought all that out. I thought it was really interesting. That was the beauty of this book, that you did the web of all these different major and influential people and how they affected him by maybe just their history. And I thought one of the most interesting chapters was, maybe you could talk a little bit about. I want people to buy this book, so we're not going to give it all away.
Well, we're just touching the surface.
And I got a lot of books. I bought a lot of books, so feel free.
I know, buy them for Mark.
But tell about, and I thought it was just fascinating, the Curtis and Custer.
Oh, yeah. Curtis was kind of I called it the next pigeon to come out to Montana, and take, he toggled between the battlefield and the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, interviewing the Sioux and the Crow. And I don't know how many books I've written about folks that come out there, pigeons, and they're basically told whatever they want to hear, or they give money to the different Native Americans out there, and they all spin stories, from Curly to the Custer Scouts. And what the latest version that he got is that Custer, and I don't know if you've ever been to the Custer battlefield, but I've walked it with Hutton and Utley and all the biggies, Dippy, and we've gone through it. And so Reno's down there doing this charge from the south, and Custer is going to go around like he did at Washita, typical West Point military procedure. And the scouts tell him that Custer stopped and just watched as Reno got pummeled for half an hour, 45 minutes, and just enjoyed it and wanted to see him destroyed before he moved on, which is totally, he might have waved for 10 seconds, but Curtis is a melodramatic person. I talk a lot about melodrama that permeates American society, from Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ramona in the 1900s into all the Westerns, where everything's bigger than life. You got the heroes and the villains, and they're easily differentiated, and then truths come out from it. But he was into this melodramatic presentation of everything, and now he felt like he finally had cracked the whole Custer case, that
Right.
all these hundreds of people that had been out there were all wrong, and now he's going to take that back. And he goes back to and starts talking to different people about it, Roosevelt and others, and how he's figured it all out. And they basically told him, you better just, stop this. Gifford Pinchot had just named a national forest after Custer, so he didn't want to hear it. And Libby kind of stopped any criticism of Custer through her life until she died in the early 19th. And so it's a great story of just one of many pigeons that have come out. It's interesting, the Custer battle, and gosh, talk about that for hours, but there have been more books written on that than any other book other than Gettysburg as far as battles. There are literally almost 1,000 or 1,200 books on that battle. We grew up as the Custer battle. It was now years ago. It was converted to the Battle of Little Bighorn. But so he spent all this time. I mean, months and months. He'd get diverted, kind of like when he was making the movie, on Vancouver Island. He gets off on these tangents and then wastes time. He told J.P. Morgan in 1906 that he could do this in 5 years, do 20 volumes, and 2,234 photogravures, 80 tribes in 5 years. He gets there and he's only done 3 or 4. Right. It's going to take another 30 years. Sorry, kind of missed on that one.
And he's doing this Custer thing in 1907, right? Right after he gets the money from Morgan, right? He's got the money from Morgan. He's out messing with the Custer. I mean, battlefield,
And those years, another really important point about this whole thing is, the story. Oh well, Curtis just dressed everybody up. He had big wagons of clothing, and 99% of his photographs, he just asked people to, show up in their Sunday best. It's kind of like after the Civil War, these Civil War reenactments where they would put on their old Civil War uniforms, or the Union or Confederate. And that's what he asked the natives to do. And only right after he got the money from Morgan, for probably 4 or 5 years, he did have a big entourage. He had 20, 30 people, because that was a marketing thing. This great project's underway. Well, he couldn't just have 2 or 3 people. He had to make it look like almost like a Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West show. And he did that for a very short amount of time. But before that, a lot of his greatest photographs that end up in the North American Indian volumes were done before he got any money from Morgan. And also he had 9 volumes left in the 20s, and he was just going around in a car with his daughter Beth and Florence and a couple other ones when they went to Oklahoma. So he didn't have a big entourage. He wasn't carrying any uniforms or suits or things to put on. People it was a formal time back then, and it was like a love letter to the Native Americans' descendants, and it worked. I mean, they still look back and love it to be able to see some of their descendants in these photographs.
Yeah, his first picture is 1896, right?
Yeah, Princess Angeline, Chief Seattle's daughter. Some people think it was 1895, right around there, 1895, 96. Then he does the Clam Digger in 98, who a lot of people have mistakenly said that was Princess Angeline. She was dead by then. And then he did this beautiful one called Homeward, where they're in that canoe with the clouds and the sun breaking through. And they're just great pictorialist images. And, he did Canyon de Chelly, The Vanishing Race photographers before he got the money.
1904 when he did that one?
Yeah. So, and, early on he would spend, I think the Canyon de Chelly and Vanishing Race ones, he took 3 or 4 days to get those. He really took his time back then. But, in the 20s, when he's trying to get through 9 volumes with no money and trying to get the end of the race, it was hastier, and he didn't spend as much time. That's why I think most of his great images were probably before 1908, 1910.
And he did feel that it was a vanishing race, didn't he? I mean,
yeah, the theme of the vanishing race was a lot of people did think they were all going to die and there
right.
wouldn't be any left. And then a lot of people just felt like, well, yeah, some will live, but they'll be assimilated. When you and I were growing up, it was the melting pot. America's a melting pot. And we were proud of that. E pluribus unum, out of many one. And so the assimilation idea, that was huge for most Americans. But a lot of people really did think that by 1900, they were going to be gone. And
Well,
so
we're
there's
we're
two
passing
parts of that.
I was going to say we're passing all the laws in Congress to help that along in its way too, from the Allotment Act to boarding schools and all the other.
Yeah, the boarding schools were a great way. They needed to get the government did a very good job of getting all their land. 98% of the reservations were gone and taken over by white people. But to really break a culture, you have to break the religion, like we've talked about. That and you have to break their cultural norms, like their hair and their dress. So when they went to places like Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Pratt ran, the famous pictures of before and after. They cut their hair and make them wear white man's clothing and give them white man's names. A lot of them were, Civil War generals that they gave their names to, like Sheridan, just the very people you wouldn't want their name, but they got them. But that's a fascinating thing too, the off-reservation schools and that whole story.
But you do think that he felt that you were about to say about the two parts that for Curtis and the vanishing race and how he saw it.
I think he I think deep down most people by 1900, when he was really starting to work on this, I think they knew that there's around 235,000 Native Americans left. I think they knew that not every last one was going to die at that point, but he was very much for assimilation. He just didn't like the way it was being done. Roosevelt didn't like it either. Roosevelt felt like the Native Americans should be able to keep the sun dance or the snake dance or the potlatch that they outlawed. And he thought that was a mistake. So did Grinnell. But they also, social Darwinism, Roosevelt felt like, sink or swim, it's okay. You can keep that. But if you can't make it in American society, then tough luck. This is competition. So they very much felt like it's sink or swim.
I thought this relationship that Curtis had with Teddy Roosevelt was pretty amazing. I mean, they literally did have a relationship. I mean, Curtis writes him this letter, pretty provocating letter about Custer, and Teddy writes him back and says no, and he does the photos of all his family, introduces him to more, sounds like, right? And when Curtis does this melodrama in DC that's a big hit, he invites him to have a dinner right at the White House for him, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I find
he writes the
forward.
The foreword for the North American Indian, and just for folks that are collecting the North American Indian volumes, if you really want to get the rarest set, find one that's signed by Theodore Roosevelt, because there's only one that's been come to auction I know of in decades, that the full set with his signature. I don't think he signed very many of them, probably less than 45 or 50, and most of those are in institutions.
So it had to change. I would think it had to affect how Curtis thought of himself, that he has this close relationship with the most powerful man in the world, that he can write him a letter that parties are thrown to him. Do you think that was in there somewhere?
Well, I definitely, and not only, I think at that time around when he got the money from J.P. Morgan and Roosevelt together. I mean, J.P. Morgan and that whole story in the Curtis story, J.P. Morgan has taken a hit job And folks will have to read the book, but the idea that J.P. Morgan was this horrible rich guy that Theodore Roosevelt hated is totally wrong. Roosevelt got huge $150,000 for his presidential campaign from Morgan, and the famous Northern Trust. That's the one thing J.P. Morgan did have busted up from Roosevelt. But after that, there were 40 trust suits, and he never busted up any of J.P. Morgan's
Right. I read that.
industries. And so they had, J.P. Morgan's the one that connected him with Roosevelt to write the foreword. He could have connected him with a lot of other people. So it wasn't a hate relationship at all. I think it was very nuanced. I mean, J.P. Morgan saved in the panic of 1907. He saved the country, the steel strike. He financed the Panama Canal. His son would finance the United States, Great Britain, and France, Jack Morgan. JP dies in 1913, but in World War I, Jack Morgan finances the whole war effort for England, France, and the United States. So the Morgan family is an incredibly important family in American history, and they've taken a lot of negative writing, which isn't fair.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of it comes from the fact that Curtis loses everything he has, basically copyrights and all the things, to Morgan. But on the same hand, Curtis lost it all. He was a terrible businessman, it sounds like. It sounds like he really just, went from one project to the next and never succeeded, other than doing the unthinkable and the unbelievable and capturing 80 tribes in 24 years or whatever. But from the other point of trying to just make it work, he wasn't very good at it.
No, he had visions, and I talk about that in my introduction. It's good, one thing to have visions, but when you have vision casting, you have to have plans and ways to work it out. And it comes up to mind that I'd like to share with your viewers that hasn't been written about before. But during his lifetime, artists went to Montana and the Blackfeet and the Crow and the Sioux, and they painted them, and they went to New Mexico and painted the different tribes there. But the rest of the tribes in the Western United States weren't touched. None in California, Alaska, the Northwest. Right. And Curtis was the only, I'll call him artist, that did all 80 tribes. All the California artists, if you want, they went to New Mexico, Arizona to paint the Indians there, and you have the Taos Society, and Charlie Russell's up in Montana, and that was driven by the railroads. The Great Northern Pacific wanted Montana Indians, and the Santa Fe Railway and the Southern Pacific wanted the mystique of the Southwest and the canyon lands, and so they promoted that, and Kaus became a big painter for Santa Fe Railway. And I think that's something that's never been brought up before. And I think it helps in my background to know something about Western artists, because there's been no book on Curtis. It's almost like I welcome him to the bigger family of Western artists. Right. Everything that's been written about him has been written by people that don't know anything about Western art, frankly.
Right.
And I think it's nice to, welcome him into the larger community and put his place, contextualize his place among other artists.
Yeah, I like the fact you brought out Grace Carpenter Hudson as, one of the few artists, painting artists that actually did the Pomo. That she stayed there because of her husband, and she painted those people. But you're right, even Dixon didn't paint California Indians. He went to Montana, and he went to he went to like 23 tribes, but he was really focused more on the Southwest for the most part.
Well, and that's what sold. I mean, the Santa Fe Railway and the Southern Pacific were huge supporters of that mystique of the Southwest indigenous people. And so the artists, they're trying to make a living.
Mm.
They're going to go where the interest is. And then all this stuff, they're trying to market it to people back east that have money, Chicago, New York. So that was natural. Most California artists were seascape or landscape artists, that actually painted there.
Yeah. And I think in Dixon's case, it was maybe a couple different things. One is as you adroitly bring out in your book, the California tribes had been very successfully assimilated or gone. And, I think in Dixon's case, he wanted to get back to that time of when they were more in their natural, how they were as a people and as a culture. And I don't think he maybe could find it in California like he could at Hopi and Navajo and, the Apaches and things like that. And because, he was very good about identifying the actual person that was sitting for him in their native language. So in some ways, he was an ethnographer like Curtis, even though Dixon denies it. He says, I'm not, I'm just, but he still does that. And he dates everything and he puts that. And in this way, I think Curtis and he overlap a great deal. Curtis's end is, I think most people have thought of him as more as an ethnographer, but in the reality, he was probably more of an artist than an ethnographer, even though he writes, like you said, I think 25 million words or something in his books. So what's your take? Is he more ethnographer or more artist, or can we even make a statement of either?
I think he was mainly a pictorialist artist.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of help. One of the things that happened with Curtis with a lot of people is, it's like I have a lot on Matthew Brady and the Civil War, because Matthew Brady was the icon photographers in the 19th century. And he did the same thing with Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan. Back then photography was documentary and it wasn't considered art. So I did a number of books on L.A. Huffman, Montana photographer of the American West. And they'd get together with other photographers and buy their negatives, and they would develop them and put their name on it. So it was more of a commodity, a sharing. And so Curtis often didn't, give folks credit for, photographing and also the writing. William Myers, which was on his team until he went to Oklahoma, he did a lot of the writing and was never credited for it.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting, that component.
Yeah. And, Curtis's brother, Ashel, younger brother, he sends him up to Alaska, does all the photography, comes back. Curtis takes all the photographs and says they're his, and then writes stories about how he's up in Alaska for Scribner's. And they had a big, falling out, and they never spoke again. Ashel stayed in Seattle and became a great photographer in his own right, but they were had nothing to do with each other for the rest of their life. But Brady did the same thing. He'd take Gardner and Sullivan photos, and it all was from the Brady gallery from the Civil War.
Well, and
so it's just the way things were done.
And Curtis's brother, I think, according to your book, if I remember right, took more photos than Curtis ever did.
Yeah, he did like 40, 50, 60,000.
I thought that was negatives. A very interesting fact. Another one of the multitudes of facts that this book has. This book could be actually just a history book as well as a Curtis book, which I find to be the most interesting thing, is that you walk away with understanding Curtis better, but you really get a good sense of the history from 1870 to 1950, I think. I don't know if you've set out.
That's kind of my favorite. That's my sweet spot. I love the kind of around Civil War, pre-Civil War to, Depression years or World War II, because all of our favorite people lived then.
I know. Amen. Right.
And I just love all.
I like this book so much. This is like, oh my God, this is everything I like. Every one of my people that I'm interested is in this book, and you put them all in. There's so many.
Yeah, Maynard
characters. Buffalo Bill. Talk about Buffalo Bill too, right?
Yeah, Buffalo Bill was huge for everybody. I mean, he was a superstar. In the 1900s, there weren't any superstar athletes. There were no actors, film actors. The big stars were like Buffalo Bill, and everybody idolized him. And I think definitely Curtis, and I'm sure Dixon would have idolized him too in their youth.
You knew him. Dixon met him. He did a picture of him. Yeah. So that's another commonality. Douglas Fairbanks, who knew Curtis. Well, Douglas Fairbanks and Dixon were pallbearers at Lummis's funeral. And maybe Curtis was there.
Charlie Russell was big friends with Fairbanks too.
Exactly. So I know I keep going back to it, but I can't help myself when I read this book, because I've always had these questions and you've helped fill in a lot of the answers. And so maybe talk about his movies. I don't think anybody realizes his importance, like with Cecil B. DeMille's and, the first native, movie with all native people, and talk about that whole thing. I found that actually quite fascinating.